Hello, and thanks for joining us today. Today we're looking at high availability, and we're going to go over a couple of different topologies, and we're also going to look at the licensing, and then we'll get into the firewall, and we'll do a basic setup, just to kind of give you guys an overview of start to finish. I'm Kelvin Peters. I'm a solutions engineer out of Hawaii and California. If you guys, have any feedback for these webinars or any ideas for upcoming webinars you'd like to see, feel free to reach out, kpeters@sonicwall.com. Always looking for, feedback and additional ideas to create content on. All right, so here's the quick agenda. We're going to go over, what is high availability, really, why do I need it? We'll talk about high availability topology, a couple of topologies we'll look at, and then we'll get into the licensing of HA, and then we'll, do the setup, as I mentioned, and then, a very important part that a lot of people overlook is, testing the failover, right? So you don't want to test the failover, when you actually need it, right? So you don't want to set up the HA, never test it, and then hit some sort of, issue in your network, and that's the first time you're seeing it fail over. Because if you didn't, set it up properly, or if there was a cabling issue, you won't see that until you actually need that secondary unit to take over, the load of the network, right? So very important step, and we're going to take a look at that on how you can accomplish that as well. So what is high availability, right? So, I like to think of it as a, way to minimize your downtime due to, hardware failure. But, it can also be used obviously for maintenance, right? So, when you're doing a firmware update, obviously the device needs to reboot. When you're running a high availability setup, that's almost transparent to the user. So you'll see, we'll keep a continuous ping going. We'll initiate the failover, and you'll see essentially we will lose maybe one ping or so during the failover. Okay, so we're going to talk about that a little bit more, but it really allows you to minimize the amount of downtime. So the big question is, how much downtime can your organization go through, right? So if you think about, if you have a single firewall and it fails, how long can you actually go with having your network down, right? So most people nowadays would say 0, right? 0 minutes would be ideal. So that would obviously be, the target, when you're talking about HA, right? So you would essentially want, no downtime, and that's why you're, essentially investing in that second piece of hardware, right? A good thing about when we talk about licensing, you don't actually pay for a second set of licensing, right? So you essentially buy the licensing for the primary unit. You associate the primary unit to the secondary unit, and it will sync the licenses from the primary unit, right? So that's very important. That's obviously cutting down on your cost, right? When you talk about having two appliances, we're going to talk a little bit more about that at the end of this slide deck. But that's essentially just, kind of what it is in a nutshell. All right, so this one is obviously a lot of lines going on here. This is, essentially going back to that, previous statement, right? So we're talking about, no single point of failure, right? So our setup, you'll see on the next slide, is a little bit simpler. But I wanted to show this because obviously there are going to be critics out there saying, "Well, that's not a fully redundant setup." So I just wanted to show you this because this would be obviously the ideal setup that you would kind of want to look at, where everything is redundant, including the switches in front of the firewall, the switches behind the firewall, and then you also see there's two ISPs here, which you can also put into a failover state, right? So you can have a primary ISP, a backup ISP, and then you can also have the two firewalls acting in the middle here for if there's any type of hardware failure. And then internally, you can also see we have a link from each firewall to each switch. And this is a term called port redundancy. We're not going to set that up today, but just so you know, you can take any two ports on the firewall, mark them as redundant, one redundant to another, and then you can essentially use it in this fashion. So you can actually cable it up to a couple of different devices, and the firewall essentially dictates which link to use and when, right? So if one link was to fail, it would simply use the backup link in the port redundant pair, okay? So that's pretty much what the topology would look like if we were really shooting for a fully redundant topology. What we're looking at today is a little bit cleaner, so it's easier to kind of talk about. But this is essentially what we're working with, right? So we have a single ISP with a single WAN switch, and you can see there's a link from the switch to each firewall, so that's important. And then there's also a link from each firewall to the LAN switch. So any connections you have on the primary firewall need to be identical on the secondary firewall. Okay, this is important. You don't want to have half your interfaces set up and plugged in on one device, and then on the secondary one you're missing half of those connections, because obviously during a failover you will essentially lose connectivity to those segments. You can also see this little red line in the middle. So you'll see this is actually representing the failover link. So this link is using, essentially it's syncing the data between the two. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that when we get to it. But that's essentially how the two devices are sharing the information. So we'll see that when we set up the HA link, and we'll talk about that a little bit further. All right, so now's actually a good time to get into HA. So if you guys are looking for a new firewall, a 27 or 3700, there is a promo that's running right now, and it's a limited time, and they call it the 3 and free promotion. And what that really allows you to do is you can purchase a high availability unit and the 3-year advanced protection subscription. And what this will give you is the primary device, so you get the device for free, so either the 2700 or 3700 based on what you've purchased as a high availability unit. And they also give you the stateful HA upgrade license. So what the stateful HA upgrade license is, you'll see we'll be enabling that on the firewall when we get into it to configure, but that really syncs the state table between the two devices. So what does that mean? Well, that means essentially when you make an outbound connection, or even as an inbound connection, what happens there is it creates a state in the table on the firewall. So that's, if you have like a TCP connection open, it's actually, keeping track of that connection, right? So if the two devices weren't syncing that type of information, when your device fails over, what would happen is that device behind the firewall or in front of the firewall would have to open up a new connection, right? So it would have to realize that the connection is broken, and it would have to, reestablish the connection. So this may or may not even be transparent if you do not use that type of, stateful sync. It's likely the user would see it. It would result in a dropped call if you were using VoIP. You would notice if you were watching a video or listening to audio, you would certainly have a break in the connection, right? So with the stateful HA, because the states are synced between the two devices, you would likely not see any interruption. And we're gonna test this out. We're gonna keep that continuous ping going, and we'll see how many pings we lose, right? And that's gonna kind of represent, the service interruption and what the end user is likely to see. I've also provided a few links here. So this slide deck will be attached to this webinar recording, which you can kind of look back on. You'll always find these in Sonicwall University under the recorded webinar link. All right, so we're going to jump out of this slide deck and we're going to jump into the firewall, into my Sonicwall, and we're going to take a look at the steps to get this thing set up. All right, so we're in my Sonicwall, so we can see I have the two firewalls in question here. Just so you guys know, I'm using two virtual firewalls, so it's a little bit different, but the concept kind of remains the same. So what we'll see here is I have my primary, which is this main Sonicwall, and then I have this second Sonicwall firewall here. Kind of have the two at the end to kind of mention the fact that this is the secondary. And I always recommend labeling them as such. So make sure that you tack on a 2 or tack on a HA or secondary in the name. You can also put primary in the first firewall, just so you know which is kind of which. It makes it easier when you come back to the firewall at a later time. Okay, so an important concept here. So let's actually take a look at this real quick. We'll take a look at licensing. And we'll just, have a quick look here. So you can see I have the stateful high availability license. Okay, so this is a add-on license for anything under a 3650. So all the other firewalls above would essentially come with the stateful high availability. So just kind of keep that in mind. That if you look at the TZ line, if you're using two TZs, this is an add-on license. But as we mentioned previously in that promo, they actually give you the stateful high availability license. You can run HA without the stateful, but again, it won't be syncing those state tables. So all those connections won't be synced. So when a failover occurs, all your connections would be essentially dead at that point, and they would all have to be reestablished, right? So you can just imagine, from the user perspective, they would essentially notice that, right? So if you're getting HA, it's always recommended, from my perspective, anyways, to get that stateful HA add-on license. So you're going to see here, I'm licensed out to 2026 on this device, and we'll take a quick look here at what we need to do to set this up. So you can see here, I have this associated products list here, and one of them you can see is the HA secondary. So currently I don't have a secondary firewall associated, but we're going to leave that as is. I'm just going to go over here. We're going to look at this one just to kind of show you what I'm talking about when we talk about associating them and what actually happens here, right? So you can see right now this one is actually unlicensed. The only thing that's licensed for is the stateful high availability and SSL VPN and global VPN, right? So these are the default licenses that come with this specific model of firewall. Okay, so this one really has no security services. If I set the HA up, the firewall would allow me to do it. So I could actually go into the primary firewall right now, associate, and just set up the HA. But what would happen is if this pair would actually fail over and that second firewall would actually take over, what would happen is you would actually have no licenses. So the problem with this is you would effectively be forwarding traffic, but you wouldn't be inspecting the traffic, right? Because you have no security services. Okay, so just keep that in mind. This is a very important step, but it's often overlooked. Okay, so let me go back into the primary. We're gonna associate this. So you'll see it already sees this other firewall in the same tenant. So if you had multiple firewalls, you would have a different choice here. You'd probably have a longer list. But all I'm going to do is click on associate, and this will take a couple seconds here. And then once it saves, we'll get that OK message at the top. And now we can go ahead and close it off. You can see actually before we close it off, now we have a HA secondary, and there's a little one beside it that would indicate that we have an association. All right, so if I go back here, let me refresh this. You're going to see now I actually show that I have support on this device. So if I click on the serial number, and now I go into licenses, it's going to look a little different from before, because now you'll see I actually have the same licenses that I had on the primary, right? So we're all set up. We're actually ready to take the next step. So next we're going to jump into the firewall and we're going to set this up. All right. Before we jump into the firewall, we actually did a few steps off camera. So what has already been done on the firewall? So the two firewalls have already been licensed, right? So you log into the firewall and then you essentially activate the license using your Sonicwall credentials. That's been done on both the primary and secondary device. So that's essentially the starting point from where we're going to pick up from. All right, so now you can see we're logged into the firewall here. So we're on the primary unit, so we're going to go into the device here. We're going to set up the HA. So it actually, interesting, so you can actually, you don't have to update the firmware on the secondary one. The secondary one will pull the update once we associate it and enable the HA in the settings here. So you'll actually, what will happen is the device will actually pull the same firmware as is being installed on the primary unit. All right, so this is the status window. So you can see right now we're currently disabled, and we have no state on the primary and secondary. And obviously it didn't find a peer, and none of the settings are synchronized. So we're going to come back here once we enable it, and that's essentially where we can see that type of information. All right, so the first thing here is to choose the active standby from what it was currently set to none. And then we're going to enable the stateful synchronization. So this is essentially, what we would need to enable if we're licensed for that feature. Obviously, if we're not, then we wouldn't be able to enable that. And you can still set up HA without it. But again, this is going to obviously help in the transition when the device does fail over. So again, a pretty useful feature. You can talk about a couple other things. So enable preempt mode. So preempt mode is essentially, if this device was to fail over to the secondary, once the primary, it looks like it's healthy again and the device is back online or whatever issue is resolved, this will actually force it to fail back to the primary unit. Okay, so I don't usually enable this. I usually just leave it like that. Under some instances, you may want the device to fail back if it was a specific ISP or something you want to get back to. But for our purpose here, we're just going to leave that disabled. The next setting is enable encryption on the control communication. So that's the link between the two devices. So this is if you want data between the two devices on that link to be encrypted. In our case, it's in our case, it's really just a short Ethernet cable. But if this communication was traversing, let's say a data center, and maybe you're going through some ISP infrastructure, you may want to encrypt that. Obviously, if it's going out of your control, right? The next thing here you'll see is the serial number. This one obviously can't be changed. It's the serial number of the primary device, the one that we're on. But what we need to do here is actually specify the serial number of the secondary device. So what we're going to do is go back over to my Sonicwall. We're going to copy that serial number and we're going to paste it in here. And then once we're done that, we're going to look here. So we have the HA control interface and the data interface. You can make this different. In our case, I'm going to make it the same, but you could specify X4, X5 if you wanted to. I'm just going to keep it on a single interface. And the rest of the information we can leave disabled. So that's if you wanted to enable the layer 3 mode. So we're going to click OK here. It'll take a couple seconds. All right, so now you can see that was successful, and now you can see up at the top here, I have this little P, which represents the primary device. Okay, so if we were actually on the secondary device, this would be a little green S, right, for secondary. So that's how you can determine which one you're actually on. All right. So we're going to go into advanced. We'll just take a quick look here. These settings I don't really ever change. The defaults work. There may be an instance that you might need to change these, but the defaults seem to work quite well. What you can do here, is force the failover. So you can actually click force active standby failover. Another way to do it is just to click the restart button over here. So that would reboot the primary, forcing the secondary to take over. All right, so I've actually, if you look here, I've already made some changes. This was, actually from a previous config, but you can see this physical link monitoring. So you want this to be enabled on anything that you deem as critical. Okay, so if, for example, X0 was to go down here, this would actually force the failover. So it's looking at that link. If that link, does fail over, does go down, it will actually fail over. Okay, what you can also do in here, you can actually do a logical probe. So this makes it a little bit more intelligent. So for example, if I specify an internal IP off of the X0 interface, it will monitor that IP. Okay, so in this case, if let's say you're monitoring your Active Directory server or something internal, if you cannot get to that device, this will essentially trigger a failover, much like the physical link monitoring. If it sees the physical link going down, that will be enough to trigger the device to fail over. The primary and secondary IP, these are essentially, you'll see I have it set up on the management interface, X2. So we'll talk about that when we get over to that interface. All right, so let's click on this one. So what you can see here is I've actually, specified the primary and secondary IP. So what this actually means is I would actually be able to get to the primary and the secondary device using their own IP addresses. You say, why would I need that? Well, essentially, this kind of makes sense, if you need to get into the secondary device when the primary is active, right? So, if you're troubleshooting with support on an issue and you need to, check the logs or something, this might be, desirable, right? So this would allow you to access that secondary device. And you can see it's allowing management on that address. So anything else would essentially be dropped, okay? So it would only allow the management to those IPs. All right, so let's go back to status and see where we're at here. So what we can see here is, we have the status is primary, which is active. We're primary, so we're active. Secondary is standby, and it shows us the uptime. So this is 3 minutes since we've set this up. It found a peer. It synchronized the settings, synchronized the HA, the stateful. And yeah, it's showing, it looking pretty healthy. We can also see the same information if we were to go to the home button. You'll see down at the bottom here, your stateful sync and settings are synced, right? So everything looks nice and healthy from that perspective. Okay, so what we're going to do is let me go back over to device, and we're going to go over to the advanced. But what we're going to do is I'm just going to minimize this just a little bit here. So this is an endpoint behind that device. I'm going to find my other window again. All right, so what you can see here is we have a continuous ping going. What we're going to do is we're going to force the failover, right? So remember, as I mentioned in our slides, an important part here is to force the failover, right? So this is just to make sure that traffic is still passing, right, after the fact, right? So you test out, you can test out your applications, right? So have a a test plan. Make sure you can get to the resources you expect to get to, right? So that's important. Make sure this is set up correctly. Make sure it's working, because then you don't have to worry when the device actually has to fail over. You know that everything is working, right, or supposed to be working. So if there is an issue, you know that it might be even something else that's potentially causing it, right? So we're going to click on the force standby. So it's going to say, this is going to disconnect obviously from our network security management platform, because that's a setup as well. We have another video on that if you are interested. But so, we're going to wait here, and what we should see is, we should see, probably a packet being lost here, during the failover process, and we essentially should come back, once that has essentially failed over, right? So you can still see we're still pinging away. So it might be even we don't miss a packet, but let's see what happens here. Bring back my firewall. Right, so if I refresh this, you'll see I can still get to the firewall, right? So you can see it wants me to log back in. And now you're going to see that I'm actually on the secondary. So you can see, I mean, we didn't even lose a ping, right? I mean, I didn't see any actual interruption. So likely, your network wouldn't have seen much of an interruption as well, right? So that's the, the power of high availability, right? I mean, you don't have to, have a device sitting on your shelf where if the customer is like, hey, my device is down, now I got to drive over there, change out the device, upload the config. I mean, this is, it does it by itself, and it's pretty seamless. I mean, I've seen a lot of high availability out there. I mean, the Sonicwall one is pretty solid. Like I said, it doesn't even miss a ping in this case, right? So that's pretty much it. Let me go back here. Let's fail back over, and then we'll call it a day, right? So let's go. This time we'll just do a reboot. So we'll click on restart here. Again, if we were doing a firmware update, I would just upload my firmware to the primary device. It would, essentially apply the firmware to the secondary. The secondary would reboot. When that device comes back up, it would then take over, and then it would do the same, repeat the same thing on the primary, right? So here we go. We're going to restart the secondary device. So what we should see here is actually let's quickly just make sure that we're still green here, because I want to make sure that the primary one actually did come back up. All right, so we're still good, right? So we can essentially go over here and we'll trigger a reboot. Okay, so we're rebooting the secondary, so we should end up on the primary, right? So I can refresh this, or remember before I said I could even log into the primary if I wanted to by that additional IP that I set up, right? So I can actually log into the primary as well, right? So right from here, you can see I'm actually on the primary. And you can see, stateful sync and settings are down. Makes sense. We rebooted the secondary, so that guy is offline. So it's going to take a little bit. That one's going to reboot. It's going to come back up. It's going to sync itself, and then we should get the green thumbs in a little while. But again, looking at the ping on the right-hand side here, doesn't look like we missed a beat, right? So pretty powerful stuff, guys. Hope you enjoyed the video. And now we'll take some time and we'll do some questions. So let's get to it.